everyone. Welcome to Saturday the 23rd, I guess. No, 24th? I don't know. Looking at them like they're going to tell me. Hope everyone had a great week. I was not live streaming last week, so I missed you all. I took a very quick drive to Sonoma, as in 12 hours down on Friday and then 12 hours back on Sunday for one of my very best friends' outdoor socially distanced baby shower, which had very little Wi-Fi, so I was not going to attempt to live stream from there. The point is, I miss you guys, and I'm happy to be back with you this week. And this week we're talking about South Africa, which, you know, when you're studying wine, you know, through all of these various programs, a lot of the New World regions end up taking a back seat to these sort of more prolific and, you know, longer history European regions. And so you get like this little excerpt of like, oh, South Africa is famous for Chenin Blanc and Pinotage, and it has a strong wind, and you sort of get these little bullet points, but you don't really get a comprehensive picture of the region as a whole. And I had so much fun studying for this week's tasting, and it made me really want to go to South Africa. I've always heard that it's one of the most, if not the most beautiful wine regions in the world. And if you look up pictures, actually I have a picture here, my little wine book. You just get these very stunning, dramatic landscapes of very mountainous regions in the back, or not in the back, closer to the mainland, that sort of flow onto these plateaus with a lot of hills and valleys, and then end up, you know, obviously at the ocean, at the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Hi, Abby. Hi, Nicole. Hi, Tashina. Hi, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. But yeah, point is, it really made me want to go to South Africa. So if the world ever goes back to normal, maybe we can all plan a wine trip to South Africa at some point. And yeah, so I'm going to try to get through all of the information that I found today and hopefully make a dent. It sort of made me realize, oh, I could have just focused on, you know, just Swartland, for instance, which is the white wine we're going to be drinking, the Semillon. Or I could have just focused on Stellenbosch. And I didn't give you a Stellenbosch wine, and I'll talk about why that is. But I sort of wanted to give you stuff that had a little more like unique local flair to it. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that. I'm just gonna wait another minute or two. Oh, I found out something really interesting, which is kind of a bummer. You know, South Africa has been impacted, we'll hear historically, by a lot of like outside, you know, often things would happen in Europe that would have a huge impact on the South African wine industry. And right now it's really struggling because of COVID. Apparently when COVID first hit, well, to go even further back, I guess South Africa has a big problem with alcohol abuse, unfortunately. So much so that when COVID hit, the government instated a complete ban on alcohol sales, both domestically for their own, you know, citizens, and internationally. They couldn't import any wine. And the reason was, they said that they were trying to clear up or open up hospital beds for COVID patients that would normally go to people who were dealing with alcohol abuse. I guess the problem is that bad. But wine producers were obviously angry, because they're like, well, that doesn't have any impact on the wines that we export. So I guess there was like 5 weeks at the beginning of COVID when you couldn't sell internally or internationally. And then they finally opened up international sales, and they reopened limited sales for internally. But then after about a month, they completely banned them again. And it's only mid-August that they allowed people to buy wine in South Africa. But even now it's on really limited hours. So like Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 is the only time you can buy alcohol in the country right now, which has put a major dent on like the South African, you know, wine tourism industry, because most people go wine tasting on the weekends, and you can't sell wine on the weekends right now. So Point is, if you like the wines we taste today, or even if you don't, and you might like something else from South Africa, support South African wine because, I mean, everyone's having a rough time this year, but it sounds like they're getting hit especially hard, which is a bummer. All right, well, welcome everyone that's on here. Hello, hello. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So South Africa is a really unique region in that it's not necessarily a New World region and it's not necessarily an Old World region. You know, it was, well, we'll talk about when it was established, but it was basically established in the mid 1600s, whereas most of the other New World regions, South America, Australia, New Zealand, you know, the States, really didn't start until the mid 1800s. And so it has sort of this 200-year leg up on the rest of the New World, but it's nowhere close to the time span that we think of for most Old World countries. You know, Europe has, you know, between 2,000, 4,000, in some cases like 6,000 year history of grape growing and vinification and viticulture. So it's sort of like uniquely in the middle of these two timelines of when wine got started. And then even just geographically, you know, this also plays into how the wine industry grew there, but it's sort of smack dab between like the East and the West. And actually that just leads us into sort of why it started, which was that the Dutch East India Company in the 1650s, you know, people had discovered trade routes, sort of the spice routes from Europe around the southern tip of the African continent to India and to the Far East. And the Dutch East India Company, which was sort of the most prolific trading group at the time, established a port at what is now Cape Town. And as soon as, you know, one of the things, we don't think of the Dutch as maybe wine people because similarly to the English, their climate has never really allowed them to grow wine. But also like the English, they really love to consume wine. So historically, England has been one of the biggest consumers of wine. And the Dutch have as well. We think of the Dutch loving their beer, but the Dutch also really love their wine. They just can't make it usually. But when they established this port at Cape Town, one of the first things they did was tell the governor at the time, who was Jan van Riebeeck. He was in charge of, well, A, setting the whole place up, but B, establishing vines. And they did it so quickly that within 6 or 7 years, I think they first landed in 1652, and the first wine they were able to produce was 1659. And another sort of fortuitous thing happened for them, which was that simultaneously as they were setting up this port, you know, in South Africa, the Huguenots in France were being persecuted for their religion. And they were trying to escape France so that they could practice their religion. And they ended up basically as political refugees going in large numbers to South Africa. Now, I don't know if their winemaking skills had anything to do with, you know, the South African or the Dutch welcoming them in, but it did end up as a benefit for the Dutch or for the South African colony, because if you're going to have anyone, you know, sort of start to establish a new wine region, you're very lucky if it's the French. So they had this massive influx of French Huguenots right as the colony of South Africa was sort of starting, and right as they were starting viticulture. And so they actually had the French teach them, you know, like, you know, 1,500 years worth of winemaking knowledge. So it really got off the viticulture to a good foot. And it helped that the first couple governors, Jan van Riebeeck, who I mentioned, and Simon van der Stel, were both big winos. Especially Simon van der Stel, he established what is now Constantia, which is just outside of Cape Town. He also established Stellenbosch. He named it after himself. So Simon van der Stel, Stellenbosch, it actually means Stell's bush, or all of the grapevines that he was growing. He also established Paarl, which is where the Pinotage that we're going to taste today came from. So it really sort of immediately started South Africa onto this winemaking path. And throughout the 1700s, it sort of grew at this steady pace. It wasn't booming, but because it was at such a strategic location for anyone who was sailing from Europe to the east, they all stopped at Cape Town or at Stellenbosch, just in South Africa in general. And one interesting thing to consider in terms of how winemaking, we'll talk about their geography in a little bit, but it's a very hot, very dry region. It's on the African continent. Even though it's the southernmost tip, it's still very hot and very dry, and it's not, it doesn't naturally get a lot of rainfall. And the Dutch, with their sort of skills and knowledge at waterways, if we think of them and all their dams, they basically built dams across a lot of South Africa, especially near Cape Town. And if you look at, even if you look at Google Maps of South Africa right now, most of the little lakes you see, if you zoom in on them, they're all dams. And so they were able to have a lot of success with agriculture that would not have regularly been possible in the region without redirecting waterways so that they could irrigate plants. So not only were they able to irrigate grapevines, but they were also able to just grow vegetables and raise animals that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. So it became a major hub for, any of the European colonizing powers that were sailing along that spice route. They would all stop in South Africa and load up on supplies, and wine was one of them. So the wine began to get dispersed, a little bit throughout Europe and the rest of the world, but it still didn't really take off. Then we get to the 1800s, and a couple big things happen. So we talked about how the English are big consumers of wine, and historically they used to drink a lot of, they had been drinking a lot of French wine, just for the factor of convenience. France is the closest, biggest winemaking entity to England. But in the 1800s, England and France went to war. And suddenly you had a lot of thirsty English drinkers who couldn't drink French wine anymore because they were at odds. And so England started buying up wine from various other European countries at the time, Spain, Portugal, Germany a little bit. But I think because they were also one of the big colonial powers, and they were sailing along that route a lot, and they already had, inns with the colony in South Africa, and probably because the wine was cheaper maybe than other European countries, they started drinking a lot of South African wine. So suddenly, whereas the South African wine industry had been, growing little by little, but not going crazy, suddenly in the 1800s, it boomed, and people were madly planting vines, and I don't know if it tripled or quadrupled, but it increased dramatically. As that was happening, phylloxera started hitting South Africa. And so people are madly replanting vines, and there was a lot of activity, and suddenly the war ended between England and France. And England and France were getting along, and England went back to drinking French wine. And as that sort of happened, the Boers War began, and England and the Dutch started butting heads. So all of this happened in a short time period, and so the South African wine industry spiked and then immediately collapsed over a 50-year span. And they had so much wine that they literally called it a wine lake. People were pouring the wine that was made in South Africa. Producers were just pouring it into rivers and streams because they absolutely could not sell it. And unfortunately, it sounds like something really similar is happening right now because of what we just talked about with the impact from COVID. Winemakers, they made the decree for this most recent set of closures on March 26th or something, right as COVID was taking off. And because they're in the Southern Hemisphere, if you think about it, that's like their equivalent of the end of September, early October in South Africa. So people had just harvested, they had wine fermenting in tanks, they're about to put it in barrels, and suddenly they're told they can't make wine. So all the wine that they're counting on selling from last year so that they can put this year's wine into barrel, it was sort of a big fiasco. And so apparently right now, wine is getting dumped over there, Grapes that weren't harvested are being sold as table grapes. Wine that wasn't fermented yet is just getting sold as grape juice. People are distilling it into brandy, which was one of the things they were doing back then as well. And some people are even distilling it and selling it as hand sanitizer. So aside from the hand sanitizer, all of that was sort of happening after this big collapse at the end of the 19th century, kind of going into the 20th century. So it was in a real state of disrepair. And so the South African government established something that was basically a state-mandated cooperative. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it in Afrikaans, but it's basically the winemakers union. What is it? The Cooperative Winemakers Union. They abbreviated it with KWV. So that's how I'll refer to it from now on. But the KWV essentially subsidized the whole industry. They set prices, minimum and maximum prices on what you could sell wine for, what you could sell grapes for, maximum yields. You couldn't produce more than a certain amount. If you did, it had to be distilled into brandy. So it was well intentioned, as a lot of cooperatives are, but eventually it had the effect of sort of negatively impacting the wine industry, because it decreased competition and it ended up decreasing quality wine production. So as they're sort of trying to stabilize the industry, the whole wine industry, they established the KWV. Then I think a lot of you can guess what happens next. In 1948, apartheid officially goes into effect. Not that it wasn't sort of already happening before, but it officially goes into effect. And the rest of the world isn't happy about that, which is a good thing. But it was a bad thing for the wine industry in South Africa. So for the next, 40 years essentially, until apartheid fell apart in the early 90s, no wine was getting exported out of South Africa. Hardly anything was getting exported out of South Africa because the rest of the world essentially put global sanctions on them. So it was a great thing for human rights, but it was not a good thing for the wine industry there. So over those 40 years, the wine is getting made, but the quality is really low because of the cooperative. No one's really motivated to make quality wine. They can't mess with the prices too much. And also they're falling behind on the world stage in terms of modern winemaking technology and know-how. So while the rest of the world is developing tools for mechanization or advanced equipment, South Africa knows none of that. So it's not a great time for South African wine. And then we get to the early 90s, apartheid falls, and so South Africa sort of scrambles to get back on the world stage. And some of the bigger regions, closer ones to Cape Town that we know a little bit more of or hear about more often, Stellenbosch, Constantia, Paarl, they all sort of scramble to compete on a international level. And we hear this a lot from a lot of New World countries or even European countries that have gone through like this period sometimes of communism, and they're trying to get back on their game. What do? They rip out indigenous varietals or traditional varietals, and they plant international varietals, which is basically just code for Bordeaux varietals. They plant Cabernet, Merlot, Cab Franc. They plant Chardonnay because those are wines that they know will sell and are popular. So for better or worse, they make really good renditions of those wines. And I specifically didn't choose any of those wines to taste today because if you're interested, they're the easiest ones to find. If you go into a grocery store and ask for a South African wine, most likely they're going to have a wine from Stellenbosch, and it's going to be a Cab Sauv, or it's going to be a Chardonnay, or some sort of Bordeaux blend. So I wanted to show you sort of the flip side of that. So before we jump into tasting the white, just a little bit about the climate and geology/geography of South Africa. I was sort of mistaken in thinking that maybe South Africa was a little bit of a cooler climate because it's at the very southern tip of Africa. And I was thinking, you know, the southern tip of South America, like where Patagonia is quite cold. And, you know, the southern parts of the winemaking regions in Chile are growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and it's a little bit cooler climate. But South Africa is actually much closer to the equator than Patagonia is. It's actually on between like the 31st and 32nd latitude line, which is on par with San Diego. So it's even closer to the equator than Napa by a lot. It's closer to the equator than the Malay Valley, than Mendoza. It's a very hot region. It's a Mediterranean climate, which means dry, arid summers, intense sunlight, not much precipitation, which, as we've talked about, is a major issue there. In fact, it's so much of an issue lately. I don't know if you would have seen stories on this if you're not in the wine world, but people are predicting that you might not be able to make wine in South Africa in coming years, like in the near future, because there's such bad droughts in a region that is already dry, and that they've already, like we talked about, had to create irrigation, and that the drought is going to get so bad that they won't have water to spare for irrigating grapevines. So it's a bummer. So maybe drink the wines while you can. I don't know exactly how short term they're thinking, but it's a definite concern. And in terms of the soils and the geology, South Africa has some of the oldest soils in the world. South Africa, actually, the continent used to be part of South America, you know, during Pangea, essentially. And it was right on the tectonic plates. So there was a lot of tectonic activity, a lot of volcanic activity. So even though it's split off on its own continent, there was still so much tectonic activity that most of the rock stratification is vertical rather than horizontal, which affects grapes grapevines in two ways. One is that water can drain more easily because it's going vertically and it's not sitting on a horizontal sort of table. And the other is that grapevines can creep down really well and get deeper, which are very important in a region that is this hot. You need the grapevines to be able to go really, really deep and reach those like lower water tables in order to stay alive, if you don't want to just dump tons and tons of irrigation into them. And in most parts of South African wine regions, irrigation is sort of a necessity. Some regions are finding ways to dry farm, but we'll talk about why that is in just a second. Or maybe we'll talk about it now. I think that was all I had to tell you on geology and climate. And I guess just that the soils are very old. It's a lot of sandstone, a lot of marl, a lot of shale, which, as we know, are all good things for vines. And just in terms of thinking, you know, I actually looked up the official definition of a cape, because lots of things in South Africa, it's Cape Town, and if you look at the way the regions are divided, it's the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, the Eastern Cape. And essentially a cape is just, what is the definition? It is a headland or a promontory that extends into the sea enough to make a diversion in the coastline. So if you think of the African continent, all of South Africa is sort of a cape of the whole continent. And then on a more microcosm scale, Cape Town is like a smaller cape within the Western Cape of South Africa. But it basically just means that it runs into the ocean. And so if you have a region that's that hot, the only way that grapes can survive or can thrive are two things you essentially have to do as a farmer. You have to plant close to the ocean so you can get breezes, or you have to plant you have to plant on slopes and let altitude help you so that you can get acidity and cool the grapes that way. You know, we've talked about that in terms of Greece, in terms of Sardinia or Sicily. When you have a hot region, you have to go for closeness to water with those breezes, or you have to go for altitude. And so in South Africa, most of the successful vineyards are either closer to the Indian or Atlantic Oceans, it's like right where they merge, or they're up on the slopes of mountains. So with that said, because I've talked for a long time now, let's jump into this white wine. So like I said, I didn't show you a Stellenbosch because if you're curious, you can probably go find one fairly easily. And most of the wines that you're going to taste from there are these Bordeaux varietals that we're all pretty familiar with. When everyone scrambled to replant after apartheid ended, Stellenbosch, Constantia, Parle sort of did what we talked about. There's a smaller region that's sort of just northwest of Cape Town called Swartland. And it is sort of viewed right now as the hottest new up-and-coming wine region in South Africa. Because whereas everyone else was ripping out these old bush vines, Swartland was originally planted by the Huguenots, like the rest of South Africa, and those vines still remained. And so it's just been in the last 20 years, 15, maybe even less than that, more like 10, 15 years, that people have discovered that there's these old vines that just sort of got left on their own and really had to adapt and fend for themselves and have essentially adapted on their own to dry farming. And they're all planted to the varietals that the Huguenots planted. And with the Huguenots' sort of French wine knowledge, they were able to better identify what varietals would do well in a climate like that. And so they planted a lot of Rhone varietals, which would make sense considering it's basically a Mediterranean climate. So they planted a lot of Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, Cinsault. They planted some white varietals like Muscat, Semillon, Uni Blanc, Colombard. There's even Palomino, which is one of the grapes of sherry. And those old vines still remain there. One of the other things they did was they trained the vines, or they grew the vines like bushes rather than trellising them up. And bush vines are a thing in the Rhone Valley that winemakers in the Rhone developed over many years because it's a hot, dry climate with a really intense wind. And bush vines, or the sort of, can protect themselves the best in an environment like that. Because the wind whips through and it's not able to pull the vines around and pull the grapes off. And it also sort of protects them from sunburn in the way that they're trained with the leaves over the top. So in Swartland, you have these old bush vines with not native varietals, but the older varietals that have been around since the 1600s. So one of those varietals is Semillon. I could have given you guys a Chenin Blanc, which would have been more indicative of it's the most widely planted grape in South Africa. But because we did a Chenin Blanc specifically tasting a couple weeks ago, I decided I would show you Semillon instead. And I guess let's jump into tasting it. You guys have listened to me talk for a long time. And then I'll tell you another fun, interesting thing about Swartland. So let's hold it up. Look at the color. Tell me what you guys are noticing about the legs as you swirl it around, and about the color itself. For me, the legs they're like slow to form, and they're not super quick moving. They're on the slower side. I actually don't know what the alcohol is on this. 12%. That would make sense. Sort of average. And yes, Andrew, you're right. It does have a sort of golden color, which, as we know by now, you guys can guess, but it could mean a couple of different things. It could mean a little bit of oxidation. We would hope not. It could mean a little bit of skin contact, which we'll see if we think that's the case. So let's smell it and tell me what you guys are noticing on the nose. See what this little sticker says. Certified sustainable, which we'll talk about again in a second. I feel like you get some really pretty floral aromas, almost like some honeyed kind of notes. Maybe like golden apple. Maybe some kind of like honeydew or melon like that. Honeysuckle is always something that I smell in Semillon a little bit. While I'm waiting for your comments, I guess we can go into tasting too. Tell me what you're smelling, tell me what you're tasting. Semillon Semillon always has a really nice texture to me. It's like a little bit waxier. It's less light and crisp, but if it's done well, it can generally have really nice acidity. Semillon is used as a blending grape in Bordeaux. So whereas the Sauvignon Blanc can be so sharp and so grassy, the Semillon sort of gives it more rounded edges and adds these more honeyed notes to it. Chamomile on the nose, Sarah says, absolutely, that's a great tasting note. Tartness, yeah, there is nice acidity in there, which is key to making a good Semillon on its own. Which means, you know, this particular vineyard is at, I think, like 800 feet elevation. Yeah. Because it is a really hot climate. So you have to plant high in order to get those cold nights, in order to lock in acidity with the grapes. I'm smelling and tasting something smoky, but I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I could sort of see where you're going with that. There is a little bit of like, I almost get like this spicy kind of note, like ginger, not spicy like hot, but like spices, like ginger, or you sort of said chamomile, and maybe a little bit of like flintiness, or like chalkiness. This comes from real sandy soils, so maybe not chalk, but a different kind of like mineral component. Sort of like, you know, there's a region in the Loire called Puy-Fumé, which has a real like flinty, smoky quality in the Sauvignon Blanc that comes just from the soil. So I could sort of see where you're going with that. So as you guys are maybe telling me more tasting notes or telling me if you like it or dislike it, one of the coolest things that I learned about Swartland is that there is a huge movement towards not just like natural wine, but wines of terroir. Carol says they smell some spice scent. That's awesome. So it's sort of a reaction to the desire of Stellenbosch and Constantia and some of these larger regions to sort of conform to the international stereotype of what a successful wine was at the time. Bordeaux varietals, full-bodied, maybe over-extracted, a lot of oak usage. So that style is like a thing. And Swartland is sort of reacting to that. It's young winemakers that are saying, oh, I want to make wines that don't taste like French wines, but that taste like wines from Swartland. And they've set up something because the way that South African wines are bottled and organized is very similar to a lot of the ways in the New World. So whereas European countries have a more regimented system for labeling and regulating wines, you know, France has the AOC system, Spain and Italy, that's called DO or DOC or DOCG. Portugal has a similar thing. And they regulate a little bit winemaking. Not a lot. It mainly has to do with where the grapes come from the region and what grapes you can grow in those regions. But sometimes they'll say, you know, you can add sugar but only this much, or you can add acidity but only this much, or you have to limit your yields this much. But they're less stringent on the winemaking itself. New World wine laws are sort of like the wild, wild west. Like I've said, in the US, granted, Oregon has slightly more stringent requirements than like California or Washington. In those places, all they care about is that the wine is 75% of the stated varietal. I think it's 75% in most places. So if you get a wine that says Pinot Noir on the label from California, it just has to be at least 75% Pinot Noir, and it has to be from the region that you said. But they don't care what grapes you grow in those regions, and they don't care at all what you're doing to make those wines. They don't care if you add acid, if you add sugar, if you add tannin, if you do reverse osmosis, if you do all this different stuff to it. That's not reflected on the label. And South Africa is a similar thing. Their wines of origin laws are very loosey-goosey. They just care that it's a certain percentage of the stated varietal from that particular region. So Swartland took it upon themselves to create their own wine laws. And they created something called the Swartland Independent Producers, SIP, that has the most strict rules regarding or with the goal of creating wines of terroir than anywhere I've seen in the world. And people think that it might be used as a model by other regions who want to mandate the same thing. So basically what they say is not only do the wines have to be from Swartland, you have to be an independent producer, meaning it can't be like a mega conglomerate that is actually based in Stellenbosch that sort of just like buys fruit and manufactures it in Swartland. It has to be an independent producer. It has to be those varietals. It has to be from the region. They also say it has to be a wild fermentation, which no one says in the world. They say that you cannot add any additions whatsoever except for a little bit of sulfur for preservation. And even they put a cap on that. So they say absolutely no sugar or chaptalization, absolutely no acidification, absolutely no additions of tannin or food coloring. And then even beyond that, they say no chemical fining or filtering. You can naturally rack the wines, but you can't chemically filter them. And beyond that, they say you can't use reverse osmosis, which is actually fairly common in very hot regions. You're basically using reverse osmosis to lower the alcohol of a wine, which you don't think about being a thing. It happens, especially in like Napa or Mendoza or some of these hotter regions. And then even beyond that, they say, here's the varietals you can use. And it's a lot of varietals. It's all these Rhone varietals we mentioned. It's a lot of different white varietals. But what is not on there is Bordeaux varietals and Chardonnay. So it's sort of like a middle finger to Stellenbosch and to some of these regions that sort of conformed a little bit more to the international standards of what they thought they should be making. And they're like, no. We are specifically trying to make wines that taste like they came from Swartland, and here's how we're going to mandate it. And they actually certify it. So it's pretty cool, I think. And it's sort of the way that I love that my favorite wines, no additions, no manipulation, a little bit of sulfur to preserve it. But it really makes the winemaker set standards for themselves and have excellent fruit in order to make excellent wine. So I think that's cool. So if you like this wine and if you like sort of wines of that ethos, look for other wines that come from Swartland. I haven't tried many of them. Unfortunately, not many South African wines are imported into Portland, but keep an eye out. Apparently Swartland makes really amazing Rhone style varietals. So really like Northern Rhone tasting Syrahs and Syrah Grenache Mourvedre style blends. Okay. And I'm glad that you guys liked it. It sounds like you guys liked it. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of time to research South African cuisine. I've heard that it's really incredible. If any of you guys have been and can talk about or give recommendations for some of the food pairings that they would pair with these wines, I'd love to hear them. From what I understand, it's this really cool mixture of like there's a lot of seafood because it's right on the ocean. But B, it's all these unique flavors of the African continent, really interesting, unique ingredients. And because it was such a hub on this trading route forever, that there's actually influence from not only Europe, but the East. And it's sort of like a fun melting pot of culinary flavors. So Andrew, yes, I mean, a natural wine is not a term that is specifically defined. For me, yes, this is a natural wine. Some people would take it a degree farther and say a natural wine can't have any additions of sulfur. But I think more and more it's becoming acceptable for a natural wine to be a wine that is fermented with native yeast that has zero additions or manipulation except for a little bit of sulfur. And that's what this is. Lots of barbecue. Okay, good to know. Oh, that's so funny. 2 of you said that. That's amazing. My favorite was ostrich. That was crazy. Yeah, actually, I heard that the ostrich feather industry was like a big part of their export market for a while. Like back in the day when everyone wanted ostrich feathers in their hats and on their clothes. So that's cool too, that I guess people are eating barbecued ostrich. I could see how some barbecue would be good with a wine like this, to kind of like cut through the spice. and just like brighten it up and refresh it with some kind of like grilled meat. So cool. That'll be my homework, is go research South African cuisine. Try to make something fun. So it's definitely a versatile food wine. You know, it actually reminds me a lot of Chenin Blanc. Has weight, has texture, but it has good acidity as well. Maybe not as much as Chenin. So because I'm sort of running out of time, let's jump to the red wine. And I wanted to give you guys a Pinotage. A lot of you might be freaked out. So Pinotage gets a really bad rep, sort of with reason, with good reason. Huge marinated steaks of it. Oh, cool. That's good. It's making me want to go to South Africa even more. And this is a pretty label. You're right, Andrew. So quick backstory on Pinotage is that in the, I believe it was in the 1920s, early like 1910, 1920, somewhere around there, the University of Stellenbosch became officially established. And it's sort of the UC Davis of the South African wine world. UC Davis is considered to have the best enological and viticultural program in the States. And like anyone who wants to study winemaking, who wants to study viticulture, goes to UC Davis. So the University of Stellenbosch sort of is the same thing. They're sort of the top resource or word on knowledge of the South African wine industry. And Pinot Noir was sort of coming onto the scene internationally, and people loved Pinot Noir, but it's a very finicky varietal, and it's very hard to grow. It wants a colder climate, so you couldn't really grow it in South Africa. But scientists, or a couple scientists, decided that they wanted to somehow make something close to Pinot Noir, and they looked around and they saw that one of the Rhone varietals, Cinsault, or it's spelled Cinsault, looks like Cinsault. Cinsault grew really well and really easily in South Africa. So they're like, aha, why don't we cross Pinot Noir and Cinsault? And that is what Pinotage is. It's not the strongest grape varietal. I really like this bottle. I wouldn't have given it to you otherwise. But mostly it has sort of fallen out of fashion because it can develop these really off flavors. It's prone to volatile acidity, and so it'll smell like dried paint or paint thinner. Famously, people say it smells like burnt tires or rubber, which is not what you want in a wine. And so it's not widely planted anymore, but it did go through a phase of like Pinotage was like the new red grape of South Africa, and it's become very identified with South African wine culture. It's rare that you will see them in the States because it's rare to find quality ones. But when I tasted this, I got excited and I was like, okay, this would be a good excuse to do a South African wine tasting. And the fact that there's cool wines like this getting imported as well. So this winery has actually been around for over 100 years. I think it's not called Tread Lightly. It's called like Broadbeck or Brandbeck. I wonder if it says on the back somewhere. Doesn't say it. My apologies. Yeah, I'll find it somewhere. Point is, it's been around for a while, but this is Parle, and it was, so Parle, like Constantia and like Stellenbosch, sort of moved over to producing those more Bordeaux varietals. And so it's more known for like those big, bold Bordeaux style blends. And the family had a couple daughters that wanted to make wine and sort of wanted to be part of this like newer generation that was more, you know, like eco-friendly and conscious of sustainable farming, sustainable agriculture, and sort of wanted a more feminine touch to the wines. So they made this second label, which is pretty new. It's called Tread Lightly, and it's sort of supposed to be like the young, energetic, like feminine energy that's coming after this like bigger, more masculine traditional winery. So it's all female run and operated, not just the girls who make the wine, the women who make the wine, but they've also hired like all women to do their marketing and their branding and everything, which is pretty cool. And it is a more kind of light, fruity, juicy example of Pinotage. Oh, and I should say, it's also, they're very proud of that. This is the first South African wine that is bottled in this eco-friendly way that is called PET. It's bottled with polyethylene terephthalate. I could not tell you exactly what that means, but you can see it has like sustainability marks all over it, and somehow the materials on this are better for the, I don't know exactly what polyethylene terephthalate does or why it's good for the environment, but we'll take their word for it. So let's put it in the glass and taste it. Screw top, which is more typical of the Southern Hemisphere wine industry as a whole. It's pretty rare actually that you'll see a cork closure. So let's put it in the glass and look at it. Tell me what you guys are noticing about the color, about the legs. Sort of hard to see here. It looks lighter in my glass than it does on Instagram. But it's actually, for me, it looks pretty like cherry red, with maybe some like purpley undertones. It's very like bright in color. Sort of looks like crushed up raspberry juice or something like that. Maybe a little darker than that. Let's look at the legs. Legs are moving pretty quickly on mine. Slow to form, but then move pretty fast. Didn't look at the alcohol on this either. Oh, ironically, this one's 14%. So legs are moving fast, but it is higher alcohol. Let's smell it. Tell me what you guys are getting on the nose. Yeah, deep purple. There's definitely sort of like a ruby purpley color in here. There's not much rim variation. Oh, and I should have said, we mentioned the golden color and then we didn't talk about it. This is on the skins for 10 days. So that's where it gets that extra little bit of texture, but it's not astringent in any way. So that's, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, purpley, absolutely. And often when a wine has this much like bright purple color, it can be indicative of youth. So as the wine gets older, the color tends to be a little less bright, and a little less purpley red, and sort of fade more into those like tawny like brick sort of colors. So we can probably, and there's not much rim variation, so we can probably guess that this is a young wine, which would make sense because it tells us 2017. Yeah. If you had asked me as a kid what wine looked like, I would have guessed this color. Yeah, it's this really pretty sort of like bright, fresh berry kind of color. Similarities to a Pinot Noir on the nose. Well, that's good. That should be what they were going for, or what the people who created Pinotage were going for. Yeah, I could see the Pinot a little bit where you're coming from. I mean, it definitely has sort of this like black cherry thing, I feel like, which you get a lot in Pinot Noir. Almost reminds me of Gamay a little bit too, in like the like fresh picked raspberries, blackberries, a little bit of blueberries. There's also like some earthier kind of notes in there, kind of like that, like Pinot Noir. Sometimes you get like that kind of forest floor, like not almost stinky, but in a good way, matched with like a fresh berry kind of thing. Maybe even a little bit of like coffee, or this kind of bitter note. Yeah, Caitlin said kind of smoky. Yeah, this kind of like bitter undertone. And that is something that's really classic of Pinot Noir. People will say Beauty and the Beast. That's one of the reasons people love the varietal, is that you get these really like beautiful like fruit flavors, but then you get these kind of like stinky, earthy undertone flavors, and together they make a really interesting combination. Jammy AF, says Luke. Cooked berries. Yeah, and that's a great comment on like, yes, it smells like berries, but are they underripe berries? Are they fresh berries? Or you're saying it's more like cooked berries, which would make sense with what we've talked about. It's a very hot climate. Some savory notes. Yep, let me taste it. Yeah, I can see that. What do you guys think about the acidity, the tannin? It's fairly light in body, and I do get that ripe fruit, but then yes, you do get those kind of savory notes underneath it. The earthy, maybe the coffee, a little bit of smokiness to it. For me, it's sort of like lighter in body with medium to high, like medium plus, not even that high tannins, medium tannins, and a good amount of acidity. Yeah, exactly, Andrew. More tannic than acidic. Yeah, it does remind me of Pinot in a way. There's not a whole lot of oak usage on this. Well, there is oak, but it's neutral oak. So you're not getting those like as much oak flavors, but it is sort of rounding the edges a little bit of the wine. Oh, I forgot to say one more note just because I think it's so badass what this SIP organization is doing. They also mandate oak usage in Swartland. So you can't do more than 25% new oak, and it has to be European oak. I just think it's cool. I think more people should do what they're doing as a region who care about making terroir-driven wines. Anyway, back to the Pinotage. So this one, the maceration on this is fairly short. And I think, I couldn't find exact information on why they do that. I would guess that a shorter maceration is a safer way to avoid the sort of negative flavors that get associated with Pinotage. I would guess that some of those more icky flavors could come out with longer skin contact, longer maceration. And so probably doing like a shorter, quicker press and producing a style that's like a little bit lighter and juicier and fruitier is a way to ensure that you're not going to have a wine that tastes like tires. We would have to ask a South African winemaker, but I think that's probably what they're going for. What do you guys think about this wine? I would say it's not the most complex wine in the world. And I don't know, maybe that's just Pinot. I haven't drank enough Pinotage to know if that's the case, if it's just not the most complex varietal, or maybe they were sort of like bound to making it in a certain way that to avoid the flavors that made it not as complex, if that makes sense. I was just happy to taste a Pinotage, period. I think I've only tasted 2 others in the past and never in Oregon. And B, one that's like fun. Erica says she's enjoying it. That's great. Does the taste of a wine ever change from the first taste to the second? So, I mean, yes. Anytime a wine starts to be exposed to oxygen, it starts changing. People will say, oh, this wine needs to open up a little bit. So when the oxygen comes in contact with the alcohol ethers, it starts to break them down, and different sort of like aromatic compounds are released, which also affects the flavor of it. So that's why you put wine in a decanter and swirl it around. Even if you pour this wine in a glass versus pour it in a decanter and immediately pour it in a glass, it will be opened up more. And if you let it, the longer it's opened up, the longer it's physically opened up in contact with oxygen, the more the flavor will sort of open up as well. It's like a party in my mouth and everyone's invited. That's what I like to hear. I definitely don't get tires. Were tires used in making this? I certainly hope they were not. Tires are just one of the negative flavor descriptors that people will sometimes use for Pinotage, because it is such a finicky varietal and sometimes lends itself to those sorts of flavors. But I don't get it on this wine either, so I'm glad that they succeeded in that. No tires were harmed in the making of this wine. Excellent. What was I saying? Oh, but yeah, so this wine very well, if we don't drink all this wine tonight at Arden, which is a possibility with the people we have here, but if we tasted it tomorrow or maybe in 2 days, I'm sure it would taste a little less fresh, maybe a little bit more on the earthier side. Maybe that like fresh berry quality would have like given way to those more like smokier, earthier notes. It's always a fun thing to open a wine and then taste it one day and the next day and maybe even the third day and see how it changes. Lewis says, definitely noticed a change after it had been open up for a bit, sometimes more fruity than others. Yeah, as a general rule, it'll be sort of like fruitier at first, and then that'll sort of fade in favor of those less fruity notes, more savory, more earthy, etc. And that's the same as a wine ages as well. It'll be fruitier in its youth, and then the longer it ages, 5-10 years down the road, it becomes more savory as well. I'm glad you guys like it. I could see this being a good barbecue wine as well. Sort of that like fresh, fruity, like good acidity. It reminds me of Beaujolais in a lot of ways, which could make it like a fun fall wine. You know, I always think of Beaujolais as pairing, like we've talked about, like being great with Thanksgiving, with poultry and cranberry jelly and stuffing and like sort of those fresh herbs, fall flavors. This could be a similar sort of thing. So try it out with some stuff and snap a picture and let me know what worked and what didn't. Yeah, I could, you know, and this could also be, you could do it fancy with like a roast game hen and some herb stuffing, or you could like have it with a burger, and I feel like it would be pretty good as well. But yeah, I hope you guys had fun with this one today. I certainly had fun studying for it, and it made me, again, really want to go to South Africa. Look up some pictures of the region. It's stunningly beautiful. I mean, all wine regions, most of them are pretty, but South Africa is just very dramatic looking. Do you have more of this to purchase at the restaurant? I don't right now. We sold out of the tastings this week, but I can definitely get you more if you're interested. I'm glad you liked it. Shoot me an email. You can always, some of you take me up on this, but you should all know that if you ever like the wines that we've tasted in these tastings, shoot me an email. That's the easiest way. Sometimes you guys will Instagram message and it'll go to like, if I don't follow you already, it'll go to a weird inbox and it'll sit there for 2 weeks and I won't see it and I feel bad. Shoot me an email, kelsey@ardenpdx.com or info@ardenpdx.com. They both go to me. All the wines we taste, unless they come in a half bottle, are generally pretty well priced considering we sell 2 bottles for $35. And if you give me a couple days, I can always, you know, get you in a couple bottles easily. So yeah, shoot me an email and I can set that up. These were fun. Prefer the Semillon, but both good. I sort of agree, Sarah. I think the Semillon has a little more complexity to it, maybe. And the Pinotage was fun as well. I just thought it was cool to try a Pinotage, period. I don't think it's the most complex wine in the world, but now you can all say you've tried a Pinotage and not totally hated it, which is more than a lot of people can say. And if you did like these wines, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but the South African wine industry is really struggling right now because of COVID. You can go back and watch my little explanation of it at the beginning, but I mean, I know all wine industries are struggling, but whereas Oregon winemakers are hardly making any wine this year, South African wineries have more wine than they know what to do with, and they really need to sell it. So go to the store, you'll probably find some Stellenbosch and some bigger style reds. There's some great Chennons getting produced. And I didn't mean to talk bad about the Bordeaux style reds. They make excellent renditions of those wines. They have French sensibilities. They've had a lot of time to figure out how to make them. You know, they're just less unique to the area, but they're very good versions. So I encourage you to go try those as well and see if you can rustle up some ostrich burgers to pair with them. All right, I think that's all I have for you guys. Next week is our blind tasting. I'm sorry for that little switcheroo from last week to next week, but we're gonna do a Halloween tasting. It's gonna be blind, it's gonna be mysterious and spooky. So tag a picture of you in your costume doing a blind tasting and we'll repost it and make you look cool. I have to figure out some kind of costume to wear, I don't know what. And I'm also gonna be announcing November's lineup at some point in the next couple days. I can tell you right now, we're gonna do Tuscany, which I'm really excited about. We're gonna do a Rosso di Montepulciano and a Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, which are 2 different grapes. We'll learn about that. We are going to do, I'm most excited, we're gonna do 3 wines from the Canary Islands, a red, a white, and a rosé from 3 different islands, all gonna be in little half bottles. That's gonna be awesome. And then the other 2 I'm nailing down. I sort of know what they're gonna be, but I'm gonna wait for a second until I can confirm the wines to announce it. So keep an eye out for that in the next couple days. Remember, if you refer anyone to join the wine club over the next month or 2, tell them to mention your name. You'll get a bottle of champagne for the holidays. Woo! And yeah, sorry, that was my mom calling me. I don't have anything else to say except goodbye. So have a great day, and I'll see you for the blind tasting next week.